That's the wrong speaker. What can we do about that? We'll try switching to that. Okay, let's see. What else do I want to do that I should have done before I started the recording? Here we are. We're talking about, is Tom here? Oh, hi. Right. Okay. We are talking about the history of the transmission of the New Testament and the Old Testament, but right now the New Testament to the 20th century. It's this thing that appears in your life whenever it does, and you don't give much thought to how you got it. But man, the amount of effort that went into preserving a New Testament, a Greek New Testament that could be translated into English is really amazing. And so what we've done is we finished this diagram, this timeline, so to speak. This is from the fall of Jerusalem in about 586 BC. That's the exile of Judah, through to the completion of the Gospel of John, sometime at the end of the first century, which would be from the birth of Jesus, roughly, until 100. And you'll notice that John is right there in the 90s, up at the top right. That's when we believe, and probably most people who look into this believe, that John was written. We'll talk about that. That's very important because that's relatively new. The idea that John would have been written that close to the timeline of events earlier on right here when Jesus was here and doing his ministry and then being crucified and resurrected. So you have the timeline of Jesus' life on earth right here, culminating in his exaltation, his taking away, what we call the ascension, in about 32, something like that. And then the last gospel written. Here's the first three. Notice I added -X right here from last week. But here's the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Then there's this pause with the great event between the destruction of Jerusalem and then the Gospel of John at the end of the century. And let's talk about this fragment of John's Gospel. That was how did John's Gospel move forward? There is only one copy of it, the one that he wrote. So if somebody else wants it, when Paul said to the church in Ephesus, have this letter read to the church in Laodicea, and likewise have that letter, the letter I sent to them, read here, did he mean that they would travel to the other church, stand there while they read it, and then travel back with it? Or did the church in Ephesus collaborate with the church in Laodicea and make a copy of it so that they could both have a copy of it? If so, then there's your first copy of the book, the letter that Paul wrote to the Ephesians. We don't know. But at any rate, when they wrote these letters, because they were inspired, because they were already inspired and had authority, therefore, because they were already in the canon of authoritative books, even though that canon had not been collected into one unit yet, that created demand for the books. And so you have to satisfy the demand. There's a supply and demand problem. There's a demand for these books, these letters that Paul wrote, but they don't have a supply. They have to make a supply. And so that demand created the need, given the limitations of their technology, that demand created the need for copies to be made. And so the people that made these copies, we don't know anything about. Nothing whatsoever. So anonymous people that we never met and will never know about, and who were not professional scribes, because such a thing did not exist yet, simply wanted a copy like you or I would, and had the one, and they copied it down word for word to a new copy. But of course, they're not inspired, right? The person who's making the copy is not himself an inspired writer of the Word of God. That's my view. And that's what I'm sticking to. Paul was. And depending on how you think of inspiration, we talked about this last week. Paul had some help with the letter to the Romans. Who gave him that help with writing that? That would be First Peter. Who helped Paul? Who sticks his nose into the business of the church at the end of the letter and says, I wrote this letter? Tertius, who we know nothing about. You get this line at the end of the book. He just says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you, and so on, which immediately raises the question of how much input Tertius, who we know nothing about, had in the actual content and the form of Paul's letter. Exactly the same thing with Silas or Silvanus with First Peter. So it muddies the water a little bit. It kind of messes with your mind. But just remember, in the case of at least Romans and First Peter and probably most of Paul's letters, maybe not First, Second Timothy, Titus, and so forth, Philemon, those are very personal. But there's another hand involved in these letters, potentially. And so you have two people now. Who's inspired? Just the one or both of them? Or in one case, maybe more than one of them, because which letter is it where he says Paul and Timothy and Titus to the church at something, or to so-and-so? I don't remember which one it is. But it'll kind of mess with your mind, your nice, neat, tidy view of biblical inspiration. Anyway, so we have now the demand for these authoritative books. And that demand is probably instantaneous, probably immediate. And so that requires transmission, which requires copying by people who are not professionals, who are doing it for their own personal use or for the use of a church. And we don't know how quick, we don't know under what circumstances. What we do know is that they view the text almost certainly as sacred. And that view of sacredness alters your calling, if you will, when you copy that thing. Are you more or less inclined to be very careful to copy what is written if you view what is written as sacred? More, absolutely more. So really what you want, if somebody's going to do the copying, you want somebody who views the text as sacred, has the highest regard for it, who wants to maintain fidelity to it. Or maybe what you want is a person who can hardly read it and is just copying letter for letter. So he doesn't know enough to have an opinion about it and decide that I don't like this, or I think this belongs there, or something like that. Maybe one of those, and both of those were true in the transmission of the text. We'll get back to that. So what happened then between the 60s when we'll just stick with the four Gospels for a minute. That's the story. That's the plan of redemption. That's the narrative. That's the life and times of Jesus. That's the life and that's the history of the redemption of the people of God. You can think of the Gospels and Acts, in addition to the Gospels being the life and times of Jesus, think of it as the encoding of the history of the redemption of the people of God in process, of which Jesus was the main player, the main character. And so between the 60s, when I believe, and many others believe, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke would have been written, what was happening with those books? They were almost certainly, by their being created, especially if Peter was behind Mark, that creates demand, which means those books are being transmitted. And they're not being transmitted just to preserve them. People are not saying, well, these are really great, so we want to keep them in a library, so we're going to go ahead and preserve them. That's more of like the Essenes, the Essene community with the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes were not evangelists. They were not copying so that they could disseminate these writings, the great Isaiah scroll, to other peoples. They were writing for themselves. Very, very inward looking. It's not the case with the New Testament books. These churches are popping up, and when those churches are popping up, it necessarily means that the word of God has to go to them, or vice versa. Probably the first way. A church pops up, now there's more demand, transmission of the text to get to that church. So it's got like a evangelistic and also discipleship teaching. What's the word for that? Sound doctrine, however you want to think of it. Understanding the old story about Jesus. And so that creates the demand. Therefore, the text gets transmitted to that church in written form. And so that continues. What do you copy? You copy whatever you have in hand. You don't wait for a second copy to check to see, which one you think is better. This is what you have. So you copy it. And that process was almost certainly already happening between the writing of Matthew, Mark, and Luke right here and forward. Exactly the same thing happened with John. How do we know that? Because we have a manuscript fragment of the Gospel of John that was found in Egypt. And the date that's been assigned to that manuscript is sometime in the first half of the first century AD. And I got to look at my notes because, I wonder what I just said. Let's see. All right, so let me summarize since I just realized I forgot something. Collecting and circulating. If there are 4 gospels, or if there are 3 gospels, if you have them, you will collect them and they will travel together. And so what we know is that by the end of by the middle, let's say the middle of the 2nd century, the 4 gospels were circulating as a unit, and they were simply called the gospel, which is where we get why do we say according to Matthew, according to Mark, Luke, John? I'll tell you why we say it. Because they said it. That's how they understood it almost 2,000 years ago. You have the gospel, the single story, in 4 forms, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then Acts, which would have been probably peeled off so that because the gospels would circulate as a unit, and then Acts might circulate separately or alongside of it, or however. And exactly the same thing would have happened with Paul's letters. You wouldn't circulate them separately. If you had 5 of them, they go together. And so what you have then is Paul, often just the apostle, and then you have the convention. Why do we say to the Romans? Because they understood it that way. The apostle, Paul, to the Romans, to the church in Corinth, to the Ephesians, to the Colossians, and so forth. And so that speaks to the authority of these books, that by the beginning of the 2nd century, which would have been the 100s, which is this period and following right here. So this is the 1st century. This is the 2nd century. By the 2nd century, these books were being circulated as a single unit. The Gospels and Paul's letters, whatever you had. We have 13 of them. But that doesn't mean everybody who was doing this had all 13 of them. And we'll look at that later. But anyway, that speaks to authority and canon. That is not a canon coming into being, an authoritative list. That is a canon already existing that's being collected and formed out of the pieces of the canon that already existed. Because like I've said before, when did the canon come into existence? It came into existence physically when the books were written. When Paul wrote Romans, we have an addition to the canon. When Luke wrote Luke, we have an addition to the canon, which was almost certainly written after Romans. All 4 Gospels were written after almost all of Paul's letters. 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, the prison. Well, half. I don't know, half. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians. All these books would have been written before any of the four Gospels or Acts. So they're out there, they're authoritative, immediately recognized as authoritative by the churches that have them, to the point that it creates demand in other churches. And then over time, as you get more, as a church comes into contact with another one, they're beginning to coalesce into a single group, a single collection of books, which will then take several hundred years before you sort of have a static collection from our vantage point of 27 books. Okay, so let's get back to this. Any questions or comments? I don't know if I lost everybody 5 minutes ago or not, but I just, I don't even, when I'm talking like that, I don't even see people, because I'm in my own mind here. So, you could be doing anything. You could be giving me bad looks, bad gestures, whatever. I wouldn't even know it. Okay, let's go back and talk about one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. And what century was the 20th? The 1900s. Yeah, it's one backwards. I chose the convention of, we're going to go 100, 200, 300, not first, second, third, because it can be confusing, especially since in BC terminology, it's the other way around. When is the second century BC? When is it? 100 to 200, second century. So it flips. So it's confusing. So I just went with, the 600s, the 500s, 600. So here's the 500s. And then it flips when you go to in the year of our Lord. These are decades, 10, 20, 30, 40, and so on and so forth. Then we hit 100. Okay, let's talk about the Rylands fragment, P52. P52 is, let's talk about the P's. Let's move forward. In order to understand the magnitude, we'll get to that in a second. In order to understand the magnitude of the importance of this little credit card sized fragment of the Gospel of John, and that's all it is. If you're an electrician, it's like a plug outlet. If you're a spender, it's like a credit card or something like that. If you're in school, it's a flashcard, maybe, or something like that. But its importance, as it's been said, in that word, is out of all proportion to its size. And so let's talk about that. Let's move forward to the 1800s. So you can see why this thing matters and why we have the battles that we have today and the hostility of the world out there to our understanding of everything we're talking about right now and when these things happened. In the mid 1800s, you have a lot happening, and none of it is friendly towards Christianity. You have Charles Lyell, who is the person, I think he was a geologist, who led the way on the idea that we live in a universe that is billions of years old. And that number's moved from 19, I think, billion when I was a kid to, I think it's 13.8 now. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, so on and so forth, which allows now for life to evolve over the course of hundreds of millions of years. That brings in Charles Darwin. And you have this very materialistic, analytical, critical approach to everything you encounter. Well, eventually, you're going to take that sort of scientific critique, if you will, for the first time, you're going to take it into the Bible. Whereas prior to the 1800s, these great Enlightenment thinkers and the ones before them viewed the Bible as having authority. Galileo, Newton, Copernicus, Kepler, all the great names. All of that changed in the 1800s with this rise of critical schools of thought. And they were applied to the various scientific disciplines, geology, biology, physics, and so on. And some of that is great for us. But anyway, it also got applied to biblical studies. That you could take a critical scientific approach to unlocking how the Bible was formed. The writings in it were formed. And so one of the leaders in that innovators, if you want to think of them that way, in that philosophy was a man by the name of Ferdinand Christian Bauer. Bauer is one of the most important New Testament scholars ever. He's one of the names on the most important, the definitive Greek lexicon of the New Testament. Bauer, Gingrich, Bauer, Bagby, Bauer, Anchor, Gingrich, and Denker, yeah. Everybody who knows Greek, everybody who studies Greek has that on their shelf. It's about that thick. It's the definitive Greek lexicon. Anyway, Bauer was in a university in Germany, and he had a professor whose name was George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. How many people in here have heard of Hegel? He's influenced your life way more than you know, because Hegel provided the foundation for Marx's views on history, economics, class, and so on and so forth. The Hegelian, what they have often called the Hegelian dialectic. That is, that history moves with a thesis, the one side, and an antithesis, the other side, and these come into conflict, which results in a synthesis of the two. So nothing is ever straightforward. You're still wondering why this matters. You're about to find out. So this was the Hegelian dialectic. Well, Bauer, who's a New Testament scholar, is influenced by this guy. And so what he does, he takes that Hegelian dialectic thinking into his study of the New Testament. What are the two sides? The thesis and then the antithesis. Well, in Bauer's mind, you have two irreconcilable strands of Christianity, because that's how they broke everything apart. They seamed everything and pulled at the loose thread, holding something together to watch it fall apart in their mind. That's what they do. And so what he found in the New Testament books was a Peter Christianity and a Paul Christianity, a very Jewish Christianity and a Gentile Christianity. And he sees those as two opposites, the thesis and the antithesis, the opposite of it. So now, with the Hegelian dialectic, you must have then a synthesis, a coming together in conflict. The two through conflict come together into one new form. There's a new form created. And so what he said was, what Bauer taught, Tübingen, this gives birth to what's known as the Tübingen School. If you hear about that, if you hear that term, that's what we're talking in seminary. This is what we're talking. He founded the Tübingen, Tübingen School of Biblical Criticism, which then shaped biblical studies for the next, well, till today, essentially. But anyway, so now you have the two sides, Peter's Christianity and Paul's Christianity. They come together in a synthesis to form a new branch, if you will, of Christianity, the synthesis. But that can't have happened until very late, like in the late 2nd century, which is where he dates John's gospel, because he views John as the synthesis of Paul and Peter. And so for 90 years, he was the 1840s or something. For 90 years, this idea of John's gospel being the last gospel, being dated in the late 2nd century, was the dominant view. So all these commentaries that were written, all this New Testament studies that was done, was based on this premise. It turns out a very, very shaky premise, that not only was John's gospel written in the late 2nd century, you now date, well, all the gospels are written in the 2nd century, and Acts, and so on and so forth. And so if Jesus was here, right? Jesus is back here. Here's the events, 30 AD or so. Well, the late 2nd century is the 170s, 140, 150 years after the events. long after all of the participants are dead.
So they wouldn't be eyewitness accounts.
Absolutely not. And so, therefore, these gospels, the canonical gospels, have no historical value. We can't learn anything about the historical Jesus. That's another term you will hear in seminary, the historical Jesus. When you hear the term historical Jesus, behind that term is this idea that you're not getting the historical Jesus in the gospels. You have to hunt for it between the lines and learn about the early church. Therefore, when you're reading the gospels, you're not reading about the historical Jesus. You're reading about what the church at that time thought about the historical Jesus. It's a study in the church's life, not a study in the life of Jesus. And so it gave rise to all these different views on who Jesus was. You got the first quest, the quest for the historical Jesus. There's now, I think we're in the third quest for the historical Jesus. There's these quests that happen for the historical Jesus. And one of the most famous authors involved in that was Albert Schweitzer, who wrote a book called, I believe, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. But what we find out is the Jesus that people find when they do these quests look curiously like the author himself, right? The Marxist is going to find the Marxist Jesus. The philosophical writer is going to find the sophist is going to find a wisdom Jesus who's an itinerant wisdom philosopher or something. The feminist is going to find a feminist Jesus, so on and so forth. All because the Gospels and Acts have no historical value. They couldn't, because they were made so long after the original writings. So we simply don't. But certainly, therefore, all of the theology of these books developed over time, over the course of 100 and some odd years. So certainly, whatever Jesus was, and whatever his original disciples believed, and they do believe he existed, they did not believe he rose from the dead. That bedrock theological belief, which I believe is a historical event, was developed long after it grew. It was a result of a growing process, shaping and growing process, as these stories took on more and more form and more and more content to them. The idea that Jesus' death atoned for sins, they didn't believe that. That was shaped by the early church over the course of decades and then a century, until you end up with this form of all four Gospels and Paul's letters and so on and so forth. All of this because, or largely because, we have something like the Tübingen School, which was allowed to argue that these Gospels could have no historical value because they were written so long after the events. Then, in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, do I have? Yeah, I got oxy. There was a find made in a city named Oxyrhynchus in Egypt, and fragments of papyrus were found, and clay pots and so on and so forth, where inscriptions are and so forth. And there was these crates. The man who went and did the crating, I believe, was Grenfell. I should have looked this up again. It's been a while. But they found, guess where they found these manuscript fragments of all kinds, tax records, lists, whatever it may be. Where do you think they found what would turn out to be the most important, one of the most significant biblical fragments ever found? How about a garbage dump, a rubbish heap, where you throw away the stuff you don't need? And so somehow, I don't know how they did it, but they decided that, hey, they found this rubbish heap, and they thought, there might be some valuable stuff in there. So they start digging through this ancient rubbish heap, and they start uncovering manuscript fragments of ancient fragments of all kinds. So many, they can't keep up with it. So they just crate them up, box after box, crate after crate after crate, of these manuscript, of these pieces of papyrus and so on and so forth. They crate them up. These are the Brits, and they haul it back to England, specifically Manchester. And there it sits. There's so much of it, they don't have, they're still sifting through it. They're still sifting through these, I think it's hundreds of thousands of trying to catalog these fragments and figure out what they are. Huh? 500,000. 500,000. And there's this guy by the name of Colin H. Roberts, who's down there. Boy, these artifact hunters, we're going to talk about von Tischendorf later. But these guys know a thing or two about value. And so this guy, Colin Roberts, is looking through these crates, I guess, or something. And he's got an eye for it. And he spots one. And he says, that looks like it's something. So he pulls this, however he did it, he pulls this little manuscript fragment out of a crate among hundreds of crates from a garbage dump where it's all been sitting there for hundreds to thousands of years, however long it's been there, layer after layer after layer of garbage. You just keep digging. He pulls this thing out, and it turns out that it is a little fragment of the Gospel of John, chapter 18. On one side, verses 31 through 33, not all the words, because it's very fragmentary. We'll look at it in a minute. And then on the other side, 37 to 38. So not only John 18:31 or John 18:31 through 33 on one side, John 18:37 and 38 on the other side, which means it's not from a papyrus scroll. It's a leaf from a book. In the early, well, it's a leaf from a book. And so he takes this thing and he sends it. How do you figure out how old it is? Well, the answer is have you ever looked back 100 years at the fonts they used? If you read a newspaper, if you go back 100 years and look at a newspaper and look at a newspaper today, it's a different font. And so professionals can say, oh, that's from the 1920s or something. That's from the first half of the 1900s. And so now it's exactly the same thing with writing. You can go back and look at letters that people wrote 100 years ago. It's going to look different from what it does today. And there's the calligraphers who can look at this and say, oh, that's from the late 1800s. Very quickly in some cases. So anyway, this fragment, the text on it, was sent to various archaeologists, and the established date from it was the first half of the 1st century AD. And so think of the significance now. So what that means is first half of the first half of the 100s. Let's go back to the convention. 2nd century, excuse me. See, I already did it. And so what that means is if John's gospel, that's a bad map too. Here I go again. If John's gospel was written in Asia Minor, which is, kind of convention. If John's gospel was written in Asia Minor, right here, right? So here's Israel, Cilicia, let's see. Oh, I'm off. Where's Asia Minor? Excuse me, right here. I need an Asia Minor map. Here's Galatia, here's Asia Minor. You come across, here's Macedonia, and then down to Achaia where Corinth is. So right here. If John wrote his gospel in Asia Minor, and within a generation of it, remember what I said about supply and demand? Within a generation of it, they find his gospel in a garbage dump down here. Within a generation, I don't know how many miles that is. That's demand. That tells you how this stuff travels. So I don't know how many generations of copying there was between John's gospel and this thing, but it wasn't much. Now, we don't know whether it was written there, maybe in Asia Minor, and traveled. We don't know how this all happens, but all we know is you get a sense of how fast the demand got created when these books were written. That's what I meant about canon. Something is canonized when it's written. New Testament book is canonized when it's written. It's not canonized when a church decides or a council decides that it is. That's already happened. And you can see that process, you can see that in action. You don't do this with stuff that's not already in your mind a part of canon, a part of the authoritative list, even if you don't think of it as a list. And so what happened then? What's the significance of this? Well, think about this. Think about what, let's go to my new map. No, let's go back to the old one. I'm sorry. I'm flipping around all over the place. Well, if you've dated, if an entire school of biblical study has been based on the idea that the Gospels were not written before the middle of the 2nd century, at least 100 years after Jesus' death, long after any witnesses or their followers are still, none of them are still alive. And therefore, they have no historical value. And all of a sudden, after 90 years or so, you get one little fragment of a couple of verses, not even the whole verses, just a little piece of it. That's all it takes. From John 18, the last gospel written. And you discover that you got an absolute end date for when it could have been written, but this was found in Egypt. So you have to move it even sooner to the time of Jesus, because you have to allow time for travel and authority and those kinds of things to happen. And if we all believe that John's was the last gospel written, you've now officially moved John's gospel into the 1st century within the lifetime of John himself, which means you've just rendered 90 years of biblical studies obsolete. An entire approach, not just biblical, an entire approach to understanding how because you're rendering obsolete an approach to how the New Testament formed and when it was written. Everything you've written basically about the New Testament, I don't know how any of that survives. And so, in my mind, it just gets burned to the ground. And so not only do you have to move the Gospel of John into the 1st century, you're the ones who have been saying his was the latest gospel. Maybe by far. You may have said, well, John's gospel was the late 2nd century. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were much earlier, the mid 2nd century. So now you got to move all that timeline into the 1st century, into the lifetime of the apostles themselves, potentially. Well, some of them. And so that's the significance of this little credit card size fragment of the Gospel of John. And so also, who knows what's in John 18 in the 30s, John 18, 30 something. What's the story? Jesus before Pilate. What's the question Pilate asked Jesus? That's this passage. So the scrap that undid the late dating of the idea that somehow I just got a goal on my watch. I'm not sure what it was for. Probably for heart rate, because I get excited when I talk about this thing. But it's just one of the great ironies of history that the little fragment found that undid this late dating of the New Testament, of the Gospels, and the idea that they have no historical value, is the passage where Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? And Jesus doesn't answer the question. That's the passage. Look it up. Huh?
I have a book, just got from the library, about digging underneath Jerusalem for centuries, just centuries. And all this stuff you're talking about, they've been digging up
Yeah.
and identifying it. It's a very interesting book.
Yeah, this stuff is on tons of content on YouTube.
Yeah, it is. Tons
On
of
this. You can, there's people digging through all of this, Hezekiah's tunnel, the temple, the Pool of Siloam, all of those sites are being unearthed.
They're digging,
analysts.
in this book that I got, they're digging both sides, all the people that are the Arab types.
Yeah.
And they're both trying to prove their own stuff. It's a fascinating book.
Yeah.
It's over my head, but it sure is different.
Yeah. You got to like it. I mean, you got to be into it, but,
Yeah, I enjoy that.
okay. So let's look at a couple of pictures. You would imagine then that, that would be treated as a pretty important, artifact, right? This is the display case for a credit card sized manuscript fragment. P52. Why P52? Papyrus 52. So as they catalog these papyrus fragments, they have to be able to number them, keep track of them. So you start at P1, the first one discovered, or the first one published, P2, so P3, so on and so forth. And so certain of the numbers are very famous. P45 and 6, which we'll talk about, Chester Beatty. P75, and what's the other one for Bodmer? I forget. Anyway, this one's P52. Those are probably the most famous New Testament manuscript fragments. Where is this on display? No, this is the Rylands Library in Manchester, England. Is the Rylands Library? John Rylands Library in Manchester. Oftentimes the fragments and so forth are named after the discoverers or the library that they're at. So Chester Beatty papyri are named after the guy that found them. So he's got his own display.
27.
I don't know. Could be. So sorry, Lori. This is a blow up because you can't see it in there. It's so small. So this part right here took me a while to figure that out. It's a blow up. That's what it really looks like. It's this little thing, right? And then they blew it up right here on both sides, so you can see it. You're not going to leave this out long because papyrus is very, very sensitive. That's why there's so little of it. That's why the surviving fragments are in Egypt. The dry sands of Egypt, a garbage dump in Egypt is better for the survival of papyrus than downtown East Lansing in a display case 2,000 years later, unless it's very, very humidity and temperature controlled. So this stuff will come out. We'll talk about this with Chester Beatty, which I saw in Dublin. That's in Trinity College in Dublin. Is that what it's called? I think that's right. But they bring this stuff out for a little while for display, and then they put it to sleep. It goes back into a vault for 10 years. Very controlled vault. And then you bring it back out, they'll bring out different pieces of it, not all of it at the same time. And so, you can go watch, you can go see it in a dim lit room, and it's all behind glass, and there's probably it's either a vacuum or some special gas. I don't know. No flashes. That's right there. I don't know what they do about cell phones now, but no flash. And then that's what it looks like, which I can't read. That's too hard to read for me. I mean, if you give me some. Another thing they do is they would abbreviate, like the names, nomina sacra. They would abbreviate Jesus and Christ and God. They use the first and last letters and stuff, so it can make it hard to read, even if you know Greek. All right. So that's the Rylands fragment. What did I miss since I was talking off the top of my head? Brings up the antiquities market in Egypt. We'll talk about this with von Tischendorf, who found arguably the second most important parchment codis. We'll talk about that in a second. The one, one of the chief manuscripts responsible for the English translation that you have in your hand right now, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. These manuscript fragments are not valuable to recover the text. They're valuable to study the transmission of the text and how it changed, how there's different, we'll talk about that, maybe text types, because your copying is going to depend on what you have. So if you have a copy in Egypt and a copy in Rome and a copy in Constantinople / Byzantium, well, that's what you're going to copy from. But that doesn't mean those copies they got their own errors in them. And so everything that gets copied from those copies transmits those mistakes. And so you end up being able to identify the different families of copies. All in Greek, yeah. No. For our purposes, we're talking about the Greek tradition, but there's a whole Latin tradition that's important. There's a Coptic tradition, Syriac tradition. So they would transmit the Latin. We'll talk about the Vulgate, the Latin from Latin in the Western Church, in the Roman Church. No, well, a little later than this, yeah. Jerome will do it right about 400. He will publish the Latin Vulgate, one of the great works of scholarship as well. And then that Latin Vulgate will be transmitted as Latin, not from Greek, but Latin to Latin for 1,000 years. Until, ironically, a Roman Catholic scholar named Erasmus, who will create the first Greek New Testament in 1,000 years or so, 1,100 years. No, he created he published an edition of the Greek New Testament from various manuscripts for the first time in 1,100 years.
That was the collection.
That was the collection, yeah. 27 books if that's what you mean, 27 books. One of the great ironies of that is he was only able to find very, very late manuscripts of a certain type, none before the 11th century or something like that, or the 1000s. So that's all I had. That's the King James version. If you read the King James, that's the King James version you read. Ironically, I didn't even know this somehow. Codex Vaticanus had been sitting in Rome, in the Vatican, that whole time, while he was using only these few manuscripts. And Vaticanus is from the mid 300s. So I don't know what happened there, but we'll talk about all that later.
47 Sharon asked about a search says it's likely a museum item number so that the visitor could likely look it up on an audio guide or a museum book.
To Laura's point, she was right. John Ryland's 47 is the library number. P52 is the publishing number when it was published. It was the 52nd papyrus fragment. Okay. That kind of brings up, in my view, I know it's provocative, but I really question, it's the kind of the just because a New Testament, just because a person is a New Testament scholar from any university does not mean he has any allegiance whatsoever to Christianity. In fact, he may be, I have one particular name in mind, he may be outright and openly hostile to Christianity, Christian faith, Jesus, all of the Bible. A lot of these guys, in my view, have fallen into historical skepticism. You could see it in this idea that because the first manuscripts were not created, because John's gospel in their minds wasn't written until the late 2nd century, you can't know. You're now a historical skeptic. You can't know who Jesus really was. That's ridiculous. We'll talk about why later. That's simply ridiculous. If you're going to apply that standard, then you have fallen into complete and total historical skepticism, and you can't know anything about the past, including Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which we don't have, I think. I'm not sure we have that. We have copies of that. So by that standard, I mean, if you have back in the day, if you have a guy who copied, well, no, I guess if he typed it out and then he put it on a printing press, yeah, that would be the same as the original. But before that, you end up in this thoroughgoing post-Enlightenment, we'll talk about that sometime, historical skepticism where you just can't know anything about the past. And that's often the argument. That's what they go back to. You can't know. You just have to recognize it.
That's one reason that the religion department of most universities is under the School of Philosophy,
It is.
which is critical thinking,
Yep.
trying to understand, put together, and hence,
Well-
hence you get skepticism.
One of the ironies of that is historians aren't like that. They are not skeptics. They believe in their craft. They believe you can know about the past, even if the earliest writing is hundreds of years after it was written. They still believe you can know. And philosophers are the same way. But for some reason, religious studies departments have gone down this path, probably because of the Tübingen School, which is still alive and well today. I don't know. So it's all based on this late dating craze that they went through. Okay, let's close with some canon. Anybody want to say anything else about that? This can be really boring for some people and can be exciting like the end of a football game to other people. What kind of diagrams do I have here? All right. This is going to be the next diagram, the next timeline we're going to go through. Let me put this up here. Can you see it? Can't really see it. I'll have this handed out for next week. Okay. We just talked about the Rylands fragment on the left there. This gives you a picture of where we're headed. And we're going to talk about the papyrus fragments, which now I need my pointer that I don't have again, my tactical end of the world pointer. But we're going to talk about that period from after the Rylands fragment until the 300s, when a significant event happened, which was the ascension of Constantine as emperor of the Roman Empire, who had an entirely different view of Christianity, or at least its utility to him, from anyone that preceded him. And there was this immediate flip-flop in the state view of Christianity and its relationship to the state. We'll talk about that later. But why was I bringing this up to close with this? Yeah, when we talk about the collection, the canon, the collection of the canon, that's a different thing from the establishment of canon. Canon is immediate. The reason the Rylands fragment exists is because John's gospel was canonized, if you will, when it was written, and they knew it. And immediately that created demand, and that demand resulted in copying, which ended up producing a copy in Egypt in a garbage dump of all places. Who would have thought that the safest place, look, we want to save a manuscript fragment. God says, I'm going to save a little fragment of John where Pilate asks, what is truth? And I'm going to save that by sticking it at the bottom of a garbage dump where it's going to sit with more garbage being dumped on top of it for, I don't know, over 1700 years. And then some guy's going to come out after, I'm going to wait till after a whole school, philosophy of biblical studies, grows up around the idea that these gospels were written late into the 2nd century and have no historical value. And then I'm going to make my presence known in one fell swoop. And then these guys going to come in there with 50 diggers with shovels, and they're going to cart this stuff, and it's going to sit in a basement. It's going to sit in a crate for about 15 years. Longer. Not quite yet, says God. And then he sends the right guy, Colin H. Roberts, who goes, that's something. And he pulls it out of that box in the midst of a box of, I don't know how many boxes and all kinds of fragments. He sees the one, however they did it, and he undoes this idea that the Gospels can have no historical value because they're so late. It's just what happened. I mean, I just told a divine story. It's probably presumptuous, but you know. Does this verify the historical truth of the Bible? This verifies this is a response. It wouldn't matter even if John's gospel was written in the no. Yeah, I guess it would. No, it wouldn't even matter if John's gospel was written in the late 2nd century. That would be amazing, because there's no other book that we have from ancient times. I mean, Homer's Iliad, they think, circulated oral transmission, not written down, for hundreds of years. Then it was written down. So even if that was true, in my view, the corrupted part of it was the idea, the premise, not the conclusion. The premise was, if a book is written, if the story is written down 130 years after the events, it has no historical value. That premise was flawed from the start. Because if that premise is true, we can't know anything about any other event. We can't know anything about anything. Josephus is gone, Tacitus is gone, all these ancient historians, Cicero, Homer's Iliad, all of it, Odyssey, movie that's out right now, all this stuff is gone, if that's true. But for some reason, it was applied to the Bible, and everybody went with it. So what it establishes is that the books were written in a time frame when they could have been written by eyewitnesses or known people who were known to be with eyewitnesses. And so therefore, that creates much more validity, legitimacy, that the stories they're telling are based in history. We have a historical belief. Our belief that Jesus rose from the dead, our belief that our belief that Jesus died on the cross, leave the sins part out. Our belief that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead, those are two historical claims. They're not theological claims. They either happened in history or they didn't. And if they happened in history, then there may be evidence of it. One of the evidences might be eyewitness accounts, which obviously there's a lot of them. He created quite a buzz. I mean, he wasn't anybody, he's Galilean. Man, he created quite a buzz. There is no doubt at this point in my mind that immediately after Jesus' death, which no one doubts, even the skeptics, immediately after Jesus' death, he had people proclaiming that he had risen from the dead. That historical event became theological premise or theological position almost immediately. When Paul says, I delivered to you what I first received, that these things happened, that he was raised on the 3rd day, that's a historical statement that became theology. And there's no doubt that was believed almost immediately. How do you explain that? They can no longer say that it grew over the period of 100 years, uncontrolled. People could just create the stories. No. No. Paul believed that. And Paul was there. He became a Christian, in my view, almost immediately after, at the birth of the church, within a few months. That's my position. Because of the timeline, we can talk about that later, because of the timeline of his life, which he goes through in Galatians. So if he was there to believe it, that Jesus rose from the dead, right at the beginning, basically, well, that means the belief had to have been there at that time to believe. And he wasn't the only one, he was late. So, you know, that's how I view it. We're in the realm of history, not theology. Not that there's a lot of difference sometimes, but okay, I just went way over. All right, I probably insulted somebody. I'm gonna get trashed. I'm probably gonna get trashed online. I don't care. All right, I'll see y'all. Nate, Naomi, Stacy,
Thank you.
you're welcome.